Hi everyone, Timothy Ferris here with a few words about cities. The word city comes from the same Latin root as civilization. It's often been said that civilization is what happens in cities. So what do we mean by civilization, and how come it happens in cities? For most of human history, people lived in what I'll call, for lack of a better word, tribes. I don't much like the term. It dates back to ancient Rome, but I'm hard time finding one that fits better to refer to a group of people, typically ranging in size from around 30 to around 300, whose primary relationship to one another is genetic. They are families and interrelated families. Sometimes someone will marry someone from a neighboring tribe or even further away, but predominantly one's orientation is around this group, and one leaves the group at one's own hazard. Tribal life was about 30 to 50 times more violent than life in cities is today. If you think, say, of a young man out riding on horseback far away from his village or wherever his tribe might be, you're not likely to think of that person alone because it's just too dangerous. One young man on horseback running into two or three of them is likely to have his horse stolen, other stuff stolen, might even get murdered. So if you're going to go out into the countryside from any kind of a tribal center, you need companionship simply for self-protection. Law enforcement in tribal societies was non-existent to very marginal, and when law enforcement did come to previously tribalistic lands, it was difficult to impose the law. We've all heard about the legendary Texas Rangers because there were just too few Texas Rangers to begin to actually bring law and order to a vast area like, say, West Texas. So it was necessary that each lawman project an almost larger-than-life image of his powers and resourcefulness. Similar thing happened with the mounted police, with the Rangers in Canada. Imposing law enforcement on a previously tribal territory reduced the overall level of violence in the long run, but not as well as simply moving to cities would, and a lot of people did favor cities for that, among other reasons. Cities, however, are made of neighborhoods, and many of those neighborhoods still exist. In a city like Chicago, you can find neighborhoods reflecting ethnicities from, I would think, more than half of all the communities in the world. In the early days of a relatively young city like New York, what you could call tribal violence or ethnic violence, simply fear and anger over people who aren't just like your people, remained a problem, and there was a lot of rioting and problems with police in New York City circa 1880 to around 1920. Keeping the peace amongst rival ethnic groups was a problem for the police. But the problem diminished over time because subsequent generations, born and raised in cities, became less associated with their ancestry and more invested in what was going on in the city. If I could give you a personal example, my father was born in Belfast and grew up in a row house in Kearny, New Jersey, where most of the houses were other Irish-American families. Nearby there was an Italian-American community and German-Americans and so forth, but people were still living largely within their own groups. But by the time I moved to New York, I was still, of course, of Irish heritage, and I've enjoyed going to Irish bars and meeting Irish poets and such. But my identity wasn't primarily that of an Irish person, but of an American and a New Yorker. I liked living in New York. It was an exciting place to be. It's a place where you could make something of yourself. So the old so-called tribal identity hadn't gone away. It wasn't that you turned your back on it, but it was no longer central to the way you perceived the world and the way you interacted with others in the world. New Yorkers had a way of being New Yorkers first, and some one or another ethnicity or nationality second. So what brought about these changes so that one could become, so to speak, civilized? First, there was wealth. Cities are the best places to make money, particularly if you're young and looking to make connections and learn how to do things better and to compete against some of the best people in the world. The basis of human wealth is markets, trading at markets, and cities have the biggest markets and they make the greatest amounts of money. If you work hard and you live in a city, you may be able to make some money yourself. Second, expertise. All these people coming into cities to do a little better than perhaps their parents or other forebears had, form communities that have a degree of knowledge and sophistication about thousands of different subjects that are very difficult to come by outside of cities. To cite one example that comes to mind, some years ago I was living in Florence, Italy, and making a documentary film for which I needed a prop. It was to be a book, leather-bound book, that purported to be one volume in a vast number of volumes of an encyclopedia of the Milky Way. This encyclopedia devoted one page only to each planetary system. So our solar system, for instance, with all its planets, was just one page in this imaginary atlas. And the point of the exercise was that there are so many such systems in our one galaxy that just to page through the book, looking at one star system at a time at a rate of 1 second per page, would take you something like 10,000 years. So I knew what the book needed to look like, and I had in mind a kind of paper and a kind of leather binding for the book. I walked to the nearest stationer who seemed to do any such work, and with my very little Italian and his somewhat more English, I explained to him what I had in mind for the paper and the binding. He nodded, went in the back, came out 2 minutes later. He had one piece of paper, one scrap of leather, and they were both exactly right. Here's what the book looks like if you're interested. That was possible because I was in a city that had many strong and deep roots in the arts and crafts. The people of Florence had been doing leather goods and fine stationery for centuries. Now, the success of cities has always aroused resentment and fear amongst farmers and other bucolics. Here in the United States, it's the reason that our state capitals aren't located in the cities. The state capital of New York State is not in New York City, but up north in Albany. The state capital of Illinois is not Chicago, but Springfield. California state capital is located not in San Francisco or Los Angeles, but up north in Sacramento. The concern of the rural dwellers was that the great wealth and the number of people in the cities would lead to their dominating politics at the expense of those living in the countryside. And today's political and social divides here in the U.S., with much talked about and a great deal of mutual distrust, is in large part a division between people living in cities and more accustomed to thinking of themselves as members of community who pay high taxes and reap rewards in the forms of public transport, the libraries, museums, and such, and those living in the countryside who tend to be suspicious of government and more likely to stress self-reliance. Now, since about the year 2007, and for the first time in all human history, more people live in cities worldwide than in the countryside. And this has had several predictable results. First, the human species as a whole is becoming wealthier and better educated. The world is turning from a majority poverty world into a majority middle class world. Young people are attending school in unprecedented numbers. And apart from a few areas in the world that have the fewest city dwellers, the percentage of students K-12 not in school who ought to be in school is almost down to a rounding error in the statistics. Second, people continue to become more tolerant of one another. The least tolerant movements, terrorist organizations, radical religious groups and such, tend to be phenomena of the countryside rather than the cities. Third, the world birth rate is falling. Farmers have reasons to have big families, but as scientific agriculture has reduced the need for both farmland and for lots of people to work the farm, more and more young people are going to the cities for better opportunities. And in cities, people tend to have smaller families. So the global birth rate is rolling over and may well avert the kind of population bomb that was much warned about a generation or two ago. Finally, the world's cities in increasing number continue to produce the world's greatest art and education and commerce. Or in the words of the poet Walt Whitman, a resident of Brooklyn, a great city is that which has great men and women. Thanks for listening. See you next time.